Welcome to Catalyst Conversations, a podcast from the Foundation for Evangelism, where we talk about evangelism, discipleship, and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with a hurting world. We hope that this podcast series can help you start a conversation in your faith community. Dr. Stephen Gunter, Director for the Foundation's E. Stanley Jones Professors of Evangelism program, talks with Dr. Bryan Stone of Boston University School of Theology and doctoral student Reverend Gary Reynolds at Yukon First Church of the Nazarene. This episode is part 2 of 3 episodes discussing how church can move beyond preservation or just sustaining to connection with their community and an invitational model of ministry.
Brian, you made the comment earlier that the Yukon Church of the Nazarene is not unique. Can you give a little more reflection on that based upon what Gary has just set out for us with some level of detail?
Well, I think of course, it is unique in some senses, but the point I was making there is that many congregations have gone through this kind of cycle where they were, especially in the earlier era, say 50 years ago, really a part of their local culture and were playing a prominent role. People knew about them in the community, but the communities change and the church ages. So it kind of keeps that same mindset of a kind of it's propped up by the surrounding culture, you might say. In a way, it's a mutual thing. So they're both kind of working together. And I see this with the Methodist churches in New England a lot. They had their heyday and they were very involved in the community, but sort of as in a cultural way. Bean suppers and known for things, that they do in the community, bazaars or auctions or whatever. Their fundraisers, their ministries, like say, for example, the baseball team, softball team, but they're not known necessarily for being anything that's bringing you could point to and say the reign of God is showing up here, or there's really a witness to God's reign or to the people. That gets confined to a spiritual thing. And then over time, what happens is as the community changes, then if they are involved in the community, it's more of a charitable way of providing goods and services. That's another problem. If that's going to be the way you connect the church to its community, there are all sorts of issues that pop up there, theological and otherwise, of identity and who you are and what you want to be. Because then now you have this spiritual core that's focused on worship or that's discipleship, whatever that could possibly mean in that context. And the people in the community are just recipients of charity or the ministries of the church. That can't be what mission means for a church, or if you just go down that road. And eventually what'll happen is the church will then move. It won't change. It'll move somewhere where the people around it are more like the people in it. And this is the pattern over and over. That's why the churches, the Nazarene, all over the United States, in metropolitan areas, are around the ring. Hardly ever do you find them continuing, or unless it's a new start, deliberately focused on urban ministry, because what they do is they just follow outwards.
A number of years ago, when I was teaching at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, a reporter from the BBC arrived because they were curious about all of these churches in America that at that time, and this is 25 years ago now, seemed to be flourishing and just doing so well. And so they were interviewing different pastors in different contexts. And there was a guy that at that time who later went on to teach at the Pentecostal school in Tennessee. His name was Steve Land, and Steve Land was interviewed. He and one of the local pastors that he was working with, and said, well, why do you do all these different kinds of things? And this local church worker, he just kind of put his hands up and he put his hands on his head like this in the video. And he said, what do you mean? Why do we do all these things? Just the Spirit got a hold of us. The Holy Spirit got a hold of us, and we didn't have any choice. We just had to do this. And the next interview is the Black Baptist pastor from downtown Atlanta. And he says, let me tell you, brother, he said, when God gets a hold of you, you better respond and do what God wants, or you're going to be in big trouble. And then they interviewed a pastor of a Methodist church of a tall steeple congregation. And they asked the pastor, you have all these ministries. You've got this food pantry. You've got this, you've got this, you've got this. Why do you do all of this? And the pastor said, I think I'd like to have my lay leader answer that question. Oh. And so the camera pans over to the lay leader. And the lay leader has this total perplexed look on his face. And he said, well, that's just what Methodists do. I mean, you can't make this up.
No, you can't.
That's just what Methodists do. We do these things, but we've forgotten why. We're no longer making the connections.
Yeah.
Gary, I'm curious. You've talked about the ways in which the people are now coming to you, in the sense of that now your church building is populated by the community and all of its diversity for various kinds of things going on. Are you driving all of this yourself? Are you driving most all of this yourself?
I think from within the church I am, but the wonderful thing is that the community connections that I have made means that community leaders are now taking on these responsibilities. For example, we offer a Wednesday supper program, which is really offered not only for the local congregation, but for everyone in the community. It's a very minimal $3 donation if you can make it. And what is interesting to now see on Wednesday nights is the multiracial, intergenerational gathering of people for that meal. What continues to be absent, except for my conversations and a few others within the congregation who have a heart for this, is that these people come to enjoy the benefits of this local congregation, the blessings of God on us to them. But the connection making is still not occurring. And I believe it's because that the majority, if not the entirety of the congregation, is unaware, has become so inculcated into a way of being the church that it has forgotten why it is they are here, so that the missional nature has disappeared. And what has taken over is, well, we got to keep this going and sustain this. But I'm not, quotes from members of the congregation, we're not necessarily ready to jump in and help along with these lines.
By the way, I'd say right there, I think that's already a telltale mark, in the sense that they understand what it means to be a community church in terms of helping. And I think that's one of the mindsets that's probably got to be explored or interrogated, because a helping relationship to one's community is not really what we're talking about in the full sense of being a missional church. That can't be where it goes. I mean, that's helping is always going to be part of it.
And it's along that line that I'm interested in your help or directions, because I've been reading things like Gregory Burns talks in his book called The Self-Delusion, and it's a neuroscience, and he's a professor from Emory University of psychology, and talks about the fact that people can be unaware of the shaping influences. They live their lives out of a behavior, out of a tradition, out of a pattern. Yeah. That in and of itself is not bad, but it fails to meet the very theology that they hold to.
Yeah, another one of those is, that's really good. You're exploring those kinds of things. What are these kinds of ways that the different cultural trends kind of make their way into our thinking? Another one of these is a kind of a culture of intimacy or family. Churches oftentimes think that's what they need to be, is this kind of intimate gathering, but it prevents them really from being a public church where strangers can be welcomed. They can find the service and the worship and the community accessible. And so it's kind of like an in-group, and churches often focus on how can we make people feel comfortable in our in-group, but there's got to be a change there in thinking about how can we open ourselves up to be a public facing church and where strangers welcome.
And it's that language of comfortable or comfortability that it scares me a little bit, because the known reputation for this church is that it is a very friendly church. I hear it all the time. just about any community people who have been to this place will say that this is a very friendly church. But when I query a little deeper, I said, who are the friends that you have made with this congregation? The answer is zero. And when I do the same thing on the inside of the walls conversation, it's similarly, well, we really want them to be comfortable. But yet when we gather on Wednesday dinners, I see that the tables are surrounded or filled with people who are of like nature and of like background. And so that the newer people tend to gather themselves in their tables, and we tend to gather ourselves in other tables. And without just being flat out obstinate and just an aggravating pastor, I've resisted the temptation to say, look, we're going to put name tags and we're going to mix these tables up. I haven't gone there yet, but I'm close to it.
Well, as both of you know, early in my career, I served in a cross-cultural context where I was immersed in a different language and a different culture. And as you are talking, it occurs to me, I'm remembering something that I experienced. Even though I was fluent in the language and knew and understood the culture, I had lived in that culture as a student. Now I was there trying to minister in that culture. And I remember that there was always this kind of fear about how to fit in, about how to connect, about how to belong. And I would suggest that cross-cultural exposure always gives rise to a kind of fear, maybe too strong a word, but a wariness, but maybe fear is not too strong a word. It's kind of like, you know what it's like when you first try to learn a language and you first try to speak the language, then you're afraid you're going to make a mistake. And so therefore you won't step up and actually say what you're trying to say. Yeah. And there's that fear threshold that you've got to get over. So how do you help a congregation get over that threshold?
Well, part of the answer to that is I've been studying a book by Eric Law. Eric Law writes in his book, The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb. Some really, really practical examples of how multiple cultures coexist. In there, he talks about power dynamics and how about you can have a high-powered area or a low-powered area, and that whites in particular tend to be in that low-powered area where everybody's equal, versus other cultures, Latino in particular, tend to think of they wait to be invited. And this white congregation of this local congregation, not only here in Yukon, but across the district, are not people who are by nature the people who are going to offer invitations. Instead, they're simply going to make space. And then those people, new as they are, have to step up on their own. And that's just not going to happen in that culture. Mostly because in Asian culture and Latino culture, there is this community understanding that we are here as guests and we're not going to overstay our welcome and we're not going to present ourselves as difficult to be along.
Are there, and this question for each of you is that, are there metrics out there that have measured or that have taken a look at how congregations turn inward? And are there any analyses of where congregations have learned to transcend the inward turn? So that's a both and question. The phenomenon of turning inward, how do we measure that? When do we know that is happening? And then do we have examples of congregations that have learned how to make the outward turn?
A couple things I would say in response to this. So these are studies that can be done. The language of metrics is a little loosey-goosey here because you're doing qualitative research rather than really quantitative stuff on this, what I'm talking about. One thing important to do, I think, is to survey or talk to the members of the congregation to try to understand what they understand mission to mean. I think this is one of the first things I would do is, how do you understand that word? How do you understand the church as in mission? One of the problems that churches like this have is that they understand mission as a line item in the budget, rather than really thinking about the whole church as missional, or beyond that, as God as missional. Um, and to hear what they think about that, and to help them process that, and help them understand, hold a mirror up to that, to what they're thinking mission is. Another one that's very helpful, we've used for churches around here, is to survey the community and ask them what they know about the church. What is their impression of the church? And it very well may be a paternalistic one, if it is one, so they understand they get stuff from the church, or they may not even know it exists, or they may have the impressions that the community have of a church are fascinating. And it's not so much a metric, but you can find out a lot of information about how you are seen in the community just by asking. So there are a lot of ways to do that kind of research. There are churches that make a turn from this. I don't know. There are some good books. I'd have to think about what titles would be good there. But almost always it requires a change in one's mindset about what mission is, and one of the most important accompanying features of this work is that they begin to understand that ministry is everyone's and not just the pastor's. For a missional mindset, it has to be understood across the board that everyone here is in mission, and that's what we do. So I think I know that's a key turning point, is when leadership begins to be spread out and understood as the whole congregations. That's a hard thing to pull off. Does that resonate at all with
Yeah, that's excellent. My sermon series most recently, and the information I share with the congregation about what's going on in our neighborhood, are attempts to unveil to the congregation that these people are us, not them. So much so that an apartment complex literally next door to the church that I've been working in for now several years is a Section 8 apartment complex. So it's filled with people who come from various issues. They have habitual issues and they have poverty issues, but nonetheless, these are people who are open to the gospel and open to certainly open to services. And I'm trying to make sure that we don't get into a codependent relationship with them. What I have tried to identify with the congregation is that 40 years ago, members from this congregation used to live in those apartments, which were then brand new and well decorated and a delightful place to live. That neighborhood has declined. And I've tried to use the language of neighbor and remind them that we are supposed to love our neighbor, which might very well mean we've got to find a way to help this neighborhood, or in particular this apartment complex, improve itself. And along the way, not do it for them, but do it with them. And there are some governmental issues that are going on. There's some inequities that are happening from the management of the apartment complex, and we're trying to find some ways to bring the evidence to bear that one quote I had from the manager complex is, when we were helping some of the people there, she said, "We're trying to get rid of," quote, "those people," end quote. The 8 families that she spoke about all happened to be Black. When I confronted her over this, of course, she did not want to say publicly that's what she said, but it was clear evidence that the racism that exists is something that is not in the mindset of the majority of the people of this local congregation. So I'm again back to, would it be helpful to help people become aware of that which they are not aware? Is there a possibility by that we can effect change?
Bryan, the language that you used touched on something that we have talked about continually at the Foundation for Evangelism, and that is that evangelism and mission is not an appendage to the church. It's not a program of the church discrete from other kinds. Well, the problem is that that's what it is being.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Is that so that, for example, I got an invitation when I was in Georgia, a district superintendent in the north part of the state who said, "Can you come up to my district and teach my pastors how to do some evangelism?" In other words, teach us how to do some. It's like
Mhm.
something that you go out and do. And once you've done that, then you've done it, and then you can go back to doing something else.
That's right.
Rather than that, the church exists as mission.
Absolutely.
That's what it means to be church. It is to be called out in order to be in mission to do the work of God in the world.
And particularly, if I could interrupt, and particularly for the Church of the Nazarene and the Wesleyan Church in particular, with a doctrine of holiness that really spells out that we are to be in relationship not only with God, but with our neighbor. And that this relational holiness becomes the theology that seems to get short shrifted in the practices of, well, we're caring for ourselves, but we're not caring for anything other than the charity which has begun at home.
I
And
love
again,
where you're going with that. Love where you're going with that. Holiness is not about, kind of fencing the borders and, letting only the pure in. It's really about mission, and that the connection's beautiful. It'll preach. One thing too, here, I think you could say, trying to get a congregation to think of itself as, what would we be if we think about what we want to be for those who aren't here yet, rather than only think about those who are here. Who do we really want to be? And that's where things, I think, really can begin to change. I was consulting with a church that is a 2-story one. You kind of come in the bottom floor, and then the sanctuary is up on the second floor. And they were struggling. It's an older church here in the Boston suburbs. Well, not with suburbs here, could be very old. It's not like suburbs at other places. And the debate was around whether they should install an elevator to help people get up to the second floor. And I can still remember one person passionately arguing against it and the money that it would cost. And that person said, and by the way, and anyway, we don't have any people who are disabled in the church now. So why do we need an elevator? And everyone kind of stopped when that person said it, because they kind of all realized, it coalesced around that we were planning for who's already here, rather than who could be coming, and thinking that's a change in a missional mentality. If you begin to think about what you do and how you worship for those who aren't here yet, that's a change of mindset.
in my hope to do some surveys on this district, particularly the 9 churches that are on this Jeopardy list, I plan to survey all the pastors on the district. There's just 45 churches. It's not a large district. But in the process, to focus on those 9 churches and to see if I can determine some of these viewpoints. The fact that the budget has a church budget and a missionary budget that's side by side rather than unified. And instead of taking on the language of the budget is missions, which is inclusive of both global missions, which the Church of the Nazarene is, of course, given to, but also the missions of reaching my neighbor and helping this, again, congregation see what it apparently is that they do not see. Again, I'm making a judgment call on that. It's just my experience from hearing the conversations of, well, again, charity begins at home. And so my next conversation is, so do we leave it there? Or is the gospel call bigger than just home?
Thanks for listening to this episode of Catalyst Conversations. We invite you to use this and our other episodes to start or keep a discussion going in your community. We hope they inspire you to begin building a culture of evangelism and discipleship to transform the world. Go to foundationforevangelism.org, that's all spelled out, or look for Catalyst Conversations wherever you get your favorite podcasts.